Snow muffled the gravel road as a county plow idled nearby, its amber light circling a shallow ditch where a purse lay half-buried. Deputies froze, breath fogging, notebooks open, sensing a life interrupted, a silence heavier than winter, and evidence waiting beneath the cold ground, newly fallen snow, untouched yet. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The call came into the Cedar Falls Sheriff's Office just after dawn on December 14, 2003, during a week when Iowa felt locked in ice and routine. Thanksgiving had passed, Christmas decorations glowed dimly in farmhouses, and the town expected nothing more than frozen pipes and slow traffic. Instead, the morning produced a question that would sit unanswered for years. The purse belonged to Emily Larson, 22 years old, last seen the previous evening after leaving a late shift at a retail store near Highway 57. Her driver's license, debit card, and a folded grocery receipt dated December 13 confirmed ownership. There was no blood, no struggle marks, only tire impressions partially erased by snow and a set of footprints leading nowhere. Officers photographed, logged, and bagged. The scene suggested movement without explanation, departure without closure. Emily Larson grew up in Black Hawk County, a community of short commutes and long memories. She attended a local community college, worked evenings, and planned to transfer the following fall. Friends described her as dependable, careful, and close to family. When she failed to arrive home, her parents assumed a snow delay. By mid-morning, the assumption collapsed into a missing person report. Flyers were printed at the courthouse copier, stapled to bulletin boards at gas stations and diners, and handed to church secretaries who promised prayers during Advent services. The local paper ran a brief notice beneath holiday ads. Winter pressed on. Investigators began methodically. They reconstructed Emily's final day using time clocks, register logs, and surveillance cameras that showed her leaving the store at 9:47 p.m., coat zipped, scarf wrapped tight. She walked toward her car, a compact sedan parked under a light. No one followed in frame. Cell records placed her phone active until 10:02 p.m., then silent. The device was not found. Snowplow routes were reviewed to determine what tracks belonged to municipal vehicles. Nearby businesses were canvassed. Nothing immediate connected. By Christmas Eve, search teams worked fields and ditches, mindful of frozen ground and thin ice along the Cedar River. Volunteers moved slowly, breath visible, radios crackling with coordinates. K-9 units attempted scent work but struggled against wind and time. The effort produced personal items later confirmed unrelated. The town gathered for candlelight services while uncertainty hung heavy. Investigators cautioned against speculation and focused on procedure. January brought bitter cold and an early thaw that exposed more roadside debris. A partial shoe print was cast near the ditch, consistent with a common brand and size. Fibers recovered from the purse strap were cataloged, blue and synthetic, later matched to a jacket sold widely that year. Forensic labs logged samples, noting limitations. Autopsy hints were not yet possible because there was no body. The case moved into a waiting phase, sustained by paper and patience. Records were reviewed again in spring. Financial activity showed no use after the disappearance. Friends were interviewed, then re-interviewed, their statements consistent. A former boyfriend was cleared by alibi and phone pings. A coworker who offered a ride was verified elsewhere. Highway cameras were limited in 2003, leaving gaps. Investigators documented each dead end and preserved evidence, knowing time could be both enemy and ally. Years passed. The case file thickened and then cooled, stored in a climate-controlled archive room that smelled of cardboard and coffee. Detectives rotated. Technology advanced. In 2009, the department revisited unsolved cases during a winter initiative. Emily Larson's name returned to the board. The purse fibers were retested with improved methods, narrowing the jacket type. A database comparison suggested a regional distribution common among truck drivers and construction crews. It was a lead, not an answer. In 2012, remains were discovered during drainage work near a rural access road 15 miles away. The location was secluded, bordered by cornfields and a windbreak. The discovery occurred after Thanksgiving, when crews hurried before freeze. Dental records confirmed Emily Larson. The autopsy indicated exposure and blunt force trauma consistent with a fall or strike, without elaboration that would sensationalize. Time and elements limited certainty, but the manner suggested homicide. The case shifted from missing to murder, procedural gears turning with renewed focus. Investigators reconstructed a new timeline. Soil from the remains matched the drainage site, not the original ditch, indicating transport. Pollen analysis suggested spring placement or movement. The jacket fibers reappeared on bone fragments. Tire tread impressions photographed in 2003 were digitized and compared to known patterns. A partial match emerged consistent with a light truck model popular in the early 2000s. Witness interviews resumed. A retired plow driver recalled an unfamiliar pickup idling near the ditch that December night, lights off, hazard flashers briefly visible. At the time it seemed ordinary. Now it mattered. Records from a nearby tavern showed a patron leaving shortly before 9:30 p.m. driving a similar truck. The man, Daniel Price, 34 in 2003, worked seasonal construction and hauled materials. He had moved counties since. A lawful approach followed. Detectives obtained warrants for records, then interviewed Price in 2013. He denied involvement, acknowledged being on the road, and consented to a limited search of stored belongings. A blue jacket matching the fiber profile was recovered, common but notable. DNA testing advanced. Touch DNA from the purse strap, once insufficient, now yielded a partial profile. It matched Price at a high statistical probability. The linkage strengthened with cell tower analysis reconstructed retroactively, placing Price's phone near the ditch at 9:58 p.m. and near the drainage road weeks later. Surveillance from a farm supply store captured his truck purchasing lime in spring 2004, consistent with attempts to obscure remains, according to forensic interpretation. Each step was documented, reviewed by prosecutors, and weighed carefully. An arrest warrant was issued in January 2014. The arrest shocked the community, not because of spectacle but because of quiet recognition. Price had lived among them, attended games, blended in. He was charged with first-degree murder. Pretrial motions tested evidence integrity. Experts testified to methods and limits. The jury heard a restrained narrative grounded in records. The verdict came after deliberation. Guilty. Sentencing imposed life without parole. In the quiet aftermath, Emily Larson's family held a private service during Advent, lighting a candle each year thereafter. The courthouse file closed, but the town remembered, measuring winter not by cold, but by the patience it took to wait for truth. As the calendar turned through the mid-2000s, the investigation into Emily Larson's death entered a long, disciplined middle phase defined by paper, patience, and restraint, rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Detectives understood that cold cases do not advance through sudden revelations, but through the steady accumulation of verified facts. Every winter, as snow returned to Iowa's back roads and courthouse steps, the file came off the shelf for review. Each review followed the same ritual. Reread original reports, re-examine photographs, recheck evidence logs, and look again at assumptions made under pressure during the first weeks of December 2003. Emily's movements on the day she vanished were reconstructed again and again. She had worked a short shift because holiday hours were beginning to ramp up. Store records confirmed she clocked out early enough to meet her parents later that evening, a plan she never fulfilled. Surveillance images were enlarged and cleaned digitally, revealing nothing new but reinforcing what investigators already believed. No visible confrontation, no obvious tail, no sign that she sensed danger as she crossed the parking lot. This absence became important. It suggested compliance rather than chaos, an encounter brief enough not to trigger alarm. Weather records were reviewed in detail. The evening of December 13 had been bitter but clear, with temperatures falling rapidly after sunset. Snow arrived later, around midnight, light but steady, capable of softening impressions without fully erasing them. This explained why the tire marks near the ditch appeared incomplete yet deliberate. Investigators compared plow routes, traffic counts, and accident reports to narrow the window of opportunity. The conclusion remained consistent. Whatever happened to Emily occurred within a narrow 30-minute span, before snowfall obscured the roadside. The community response never fully faded. Each December, the local paper ran a short remembrance, careful not to speculate. Emily's photograph reappeared near holiday classifieds, her smile framed by holly graphics chosen by an editor who remembered her age. Churches included her name during prayers for the missing long after her status changed. For older residents, particularly men who had spent decades working outdoors or commuting rural highways, the case struck a familiar nerve. It represented the vulnerability of ordinary routines, disrupted by an unknown presence. Technological limitations of the early 2000s remained a constant challenge. Cell phone triangulation was imprecise, security cameras were sparse, and DNA methods were still evolving. Evidence that could not speak in 2003 was carefully preserved for the day it might. The purse recovered from the ditch became central. It was stored flat, protected from further degradation. Investigators resisted the urge to test aggressively, knowing each examination risked consumption of material that might be more valuable later. When remains were recovered in 2012, the case entered a new phase grounded in forensic confirmation. The location of discovery was not random. The drainage site lay near a seldom-used access road maintained by the county but known to locals who hauled equipment or hunted nearby. Soil composition, plant growth, and erosion patterns suggested placement rather than accidental deposition. The remains' position indicated concealment without care, consistent with haste and familiarity rather than planning. The autopsy findings, limited by time and environment, nonetheless provided direction. There were no indications of prolonged captivity. Trauma markers suggested a brief encounter that escalated quickly. Exposure accounted for additional degradation, reinforcing the winter context of the crime. Investigators avoided speculation and documented only what could be supported. This restraint later proved critical. Attention returned to individuals whose routines intersected with rural roads late at night. Construction workers, delivery drivers, and seasonal laborers were identified through employment records and interviewed where possible. Many had moved on, some out of state. Each interview was conducted methodically, notes taken, inconsistencies flagged but not exaggerated. The goal was exclusion as much as inclusion. Daniel Price emerged slowly from this process rather than through a single tip. In 2003, he lived within commuting distance and worked irregular hours. He owned a light pickup truck consistent with the partial tread impressions documented near the ditch. At the time, this placed him among hundreds. What distinguished him years later was persistence in the records. His name appeared repeatedly near the periphery: a tavern receipt, a fuel purchase, a vehicle service record. None were incriminating alone. Together, They formed a pattern worth closer examination. Investigators requested voluntary interviews before pursuing warrants. Price's initial cooperation appeared calm and controlled. He acknowledged being on the road that night, citing weather concerns and routine errands. His timeline aligned broadly with known conditions but left unexplained gaps. When asked about Emily Larson, he stated he did not know her. No direct contradiction surfaced, but the interview raised quiet questions documented carefully for future reference. Advances in forensic science accelerated the case's momentum. Touch DNA analysis, once unreliable, had matured. Samples from the purse strap were re-examined using updated protocols. The resulting profile was partial but statistically meaningful. When compared against databases and potential suspects, it aligned with Price at a probability that exceeded thresholds accepted by courts. This result did not stand alone. It was treated as one element among many. Cell phone data, once dismissed as too coarse, was reconstructed using archived carrier records and improved modeling. Analysts placed Price's phone within range of the ditch during the critical minutes after Emily left work. Later data showed presence near the drainage site months afterward. While not definitive proof of action, the consistency reinforced the emerging narrative. Investigators sought corroboration through physical evidence. A jacket recovered from Price's stored belongings matched the fiber type documented years earlier. The jacket was common, but where patterns and fiber composition strengthened the association. Farm supply receipts showed lime purchases consistent with forensic interpretation of the burial environment. Each piece was verified independently, reducing reliance on any single conclusion. The decision to arrest was not rushed. Prosecutors reviewed the case line by line, anticipating scrutiny from defense counsel and jurors. Warrants were executed lawfully, evidence logged transparently. When Price was taken into custody in January, the process was quiet, almost routine. There were no dramatic scenes, only paperwork and procedure, reflecting the tone investigators had maintained from the beginning. As the legal process unfolded, the community responded with subdued shock. Many recognized Price's name from everyday interactions. This familiarity underscored the case's central lesson. Violence does not always announce itself. It can exist alongside ordinary routines, revealed only through time and diligence. For Emily Larson's family, the arrest marked the end of uncertainty but not of grief. They attended hearings quietly, supported by friends who had waited years for answers. The trial focused on evidence rather than emotion. Expert testimony explained forensic limits and strengths. Timelines were reconstructed carefully, with attention to winter conditions and rural context. The jury deliberated without spectacle. When the verdict was delivered, it reflected confidence in the process rather than satisfaction. Justice, in this case, arrived slowly and without celebration. In the aftermath, Emily's name returned to the community in a different way. Scholarships were established quietly. Her photograph remained on a courthouse bulletin board, now framed, a reminder of persistence. Each December, as snow returned to Iowa roads, investigators reflected on the case as an example of why files are never truly closed until every lead is exhausted. Emily Larson's story became part of the town's memory, measured not in headlines but in the quiet resolve that carried it from winter to winter until truth finally held. The third phase of the Emily Larson investigation unfolded largely away from public view, shaped by procedure rather than momentum, and grounded in a belief shared by seasoned investigators that time itself can become an evidentiary tool. By 2013, nearly a decade after her disappearance, the case no longer lived in urgency but in endurance. Detectives assigned to the file were men who had worked hundreds of routine deaths, traffic fatalities, and domestic incidents, and who understood that cold cases require emotional distance. Their approach was not fueled by outrage or public pressure, but by the discipline of reconstruction. Reconstruction became the guiding principle. Every confirmed fact was pinned to a timeline that stretched from the afternoon of December 13, 2003, to the spring months of 2004. Investigators tracked weather changes, road maintenance schedules, agricultural activity, and school calendars. They noted when fields would have been plowed, when drainage crews typically worked, and when seasonal traffic patterns shifted. These details mattered because the burial location suggested knowledge of rural cycles. Whoever placed Emily's remains there understood when the land would be quiet and when it would not. The drainage site itself was analyzed again. Survey maps showed it was not visible from the main road and required a deliberate turn onto a gravel access path. Tire marks from heavy vehicles had been common there during planting season, offering cover for movement without notice. Soil samples taken during the recovery were compared to residue found on a tarp recovered from a storage unit linked to Daniel Price. The match was not absolute, but mineral composition and organic content aligned closely enough to support a shared environment. Investigators revisited witness interviews with renewed context. Statements that once seemed neutral acquired new significance when aligned with the updated timeline. A farmer recalled hearing a truck late one night in early spring 2004, idling near the drainage area longer than expected. At the time, it registered as inconvenience. Years later, it suggested opportunity. Another witness remembered seeing Price's truck at a farm supply store unusually late in the season. Receipts confirmed the purchase. Each recollection was documented cautiously, mindful of memory decay. The prosecution's strategy depended on cumulative clarity rather than a single decisive moment. They built their case as a layered narrative of movement, opportunity, and forensic linkage. Defense challenges were anticipated. Common items were acknowledged as common. Limitations were conceded openly. This transparency strengthened credibility. Jurors would be asked not to believe in certainty beyond doubt, but in probability beyond reason. Media attention intensified briefly after the arrest, then subsided. Local coverage remained restrained, reflecting community norms. Reporters relied on court records rather than speculation. Older residents followed developments quietly, reading print editions over morning coffee. For many, the case evoked memories of a different era, when towns felt smaller and trust felt implicit. The realization that harm had entered that space unsettled them. During pretrial hearings, evidence was scrutinized line by line. Chain of custody records were examined to ensure no contamination. Forensic experts explained advances in DNA analysis without overstating precision. Cell data analysts described margins of error honestly. The judge ruled methodically, admitting evidence that met standards and excluding what did not. The process reinforced the legitimacy of the outcome regardless of verdict. Trial proceedings unfolded over several weeks. The courtroom atmosphere was subdued. There were no dramatic gestures, no emotional appeals. Instead, exhibits were displayed methodically: maps, charts, photographs, receipts. The jury listened to explanations of winter weather effects on evidence preservation. They learned about rural Iowa geography, about how snow and thaw alter landscapes, and about how routine movements can intersect tragically. Emily Larson's life was presented briefly and respectfully, contextualizing the loss without sentimentalization. She was described through records and testimony as a young woman building a future, grounded in family and work. This framing avoided exploitation and maintained focus on the investigation's purpose rather than its emotional weight. Daniel Price's background was introduced in similarly restrained terms. Employment records showed irregular work patterns. Financial records indicated stress during the period following Emily's disappearance. Behavioral analysis suggested familiarity with the region rather than transience. None of this alone proved guilt. Together, it supported motive and access within a lawful framework. The defense argued coincidence and challenged inference. They emphasized the commonality of evidence and the passage of time. Prosecutors responded by reinforcing convergence. They reminded jurors that cold cases rely on convergence because perpetrators often exploit time and anonymity. The standard was not perfection, but coherence supported by evidence. Deliberations were deliberate. Jurors requested clarification on forensic probabilities and timeline overlaps. They reviewed exhibits again. When the verdict was reached, it reflected consensus built on method rather than emotion. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing followed statutory guidelines, resulting in life imprisonment without parole. The legal outcome closed the case formally, but its impact continued quietly. Investigators documented lessons learned for future cases, noting the value of evidence preservation and periodic review. The sheriff's office updated protocols for cold case management. Emily Larson's file was archived with annotations reflecting resolution. In the months after sentencing, the community returned to routine. Winter gave way to spring, fields were planted and roads were repaired. Yet each December, as snow fell again, the memory resurfaced. The case became a reference point in conversations about vigilance and patience. It reminded residents that justice, when pursued methodically, can outlast time. For Emily's family, the resolution offered a measure of peace defined not by relief, but by certainty. They visited the drainage site once, privately, and then focused on remembrance rather than location. The scholarship fund grew modestly, supporting local students. Her name appeared each year in a small notice during the holidays, framed not as tragedy but as commitment. The investigation concluded not with celebration but with quiet acknowledgement. It affirmed that even in rural communities shaped by routine and trust, accountability depends on diligence. Emily Larson's case demonstrated that cold cases are not abandoned stories but deferred ones, waiting for the moment when evidence, technology, and resolve align. The fourth segment of the Emily Larson case focused less on courtroom proceedings and more on the institutional and human consequences that followed the verdict. Once Daniel Price was sentenced, the machinery of the justice system shifted from pursuit to preservation. Records were finalized, appeals timelines were noted, and evidence was secured for long-term retention. For the investigators who had carried the file through winters and rotations, this phase was about accuracy rather than emotion. A solved case demanded the same discipline as an open one. Internal reviews were conducted within the sheriff's office. These were not fault-finding exercises, but structured evaluations meant to refine future investigations. Supervisors examined how early assumptions were handled, how evidence was protected, and how technological gaps had influenced progress. The Emily Larson case became a training reference, illustrating the importance of restraint in the early days of an investigation and persistence in the years that followed. Younger deputies were briefed on how ordinary details, when preserved, can later become decisive. The role of seasonal context was emphasized repeatedly. December in Iowa shapes behavior. Roads empty earlier. Visibility narrows. People hurry home to warmth and family obligations. Investigators concluded that the timing of the crime was not incidental. The offender exploited reduced traffic and the anonymity that winter darkness provides. This understanding informed future patrol strategies during holiday periods, especially in rural zones where isolation can increase vulnerability. The courthouse returned to its normal rhythm. Holiday decorations were removed. Case numbers advanced. Yet the presence of the Larson file lingered in clerks, offices, and among legal staff who remembered its weight. It had required patience from everyone involved, from lab technicians waiting for improved methods to prosecutors resisting premature charges. Its resolution reinforced confidence in procedural justice rather than dramatic intervention. Local media revisited the case one final time with a long-form article published just before Christmas the year after sentencing. The tone was reflective, not celebratory. It traced the timeline, acknowledged limitations, and avoided sensational detail. Letters to the editor expressed quiet gratitude for closure and respect for the family's privacy. Older readers, particularly men who had watched the town change over decades, recognized the story as one of endurance rather than spectacle. Emily Larson's parents declined public interviews. Their statement, released through the prosecutor's office, thanked investigators and requested continued focus on missing persons awareness. They emphasized that their daughter's life should be remembered for its promise, not its end. This restraint shaped how the community discussed the case thereafter. It became less about the crime and more about the responsibility shared by institutions and neighbors. Daniel Price's incarceration followed routine procedures. He was transferred to a state facility where he would spend the remainder of his life. Appeals were filed and denied based on the strength and legality of the evidence. Each denial reaffirmed the original verdict. Over time, his name faded from local conversation, mentioned only in procedural updates buried in legal notices. The physical locations tied to the case resumed ordinary use. The ditch where the purse was found was regraded during routine road maintenance. The drainage site returned to quiet obscurity, known only to those who worked nearby fields. Investigators noted the importance of documenting such sites thoroughly, knowing that landscapes change and memory fades. Photographs and maps preserved the past even as the present moved on. Every Thanksgiving after the case closed, the sheriff's office conducted a review of unresolved missing persons files. Emily Larson's case was cited as proof that persistence matters. Deputies were reminded that cold cases are not failures but responsibilities deferred. This institutional memory became part of the department's culture, influencing how new cases were handled from the outset. For the community, the resolution altered perception subtly but permanently. Trust remained, but it was tempered by awareness. Parents reminded daughters to check in during winter drives. Employers adjusted late-shift policies. These changes were not driven by fear but by experience. The town absorbed the lesson quietly, as it had absorbed the loss. The seasonal cycle continued. Snow returned each December, followed by thaw and planting. Life moved forward, but the case remained a reference point in conversations about justice that does not rush and truth that does not expire. Older residents, especially those nearing retirement, reflected on how many winters they had seen and how few had carried such weight. The case became part of the town's history, woven into its understanding of itself. From an investigative standpoint, the Emily Larson case underscored the value of verifiable closure. There were no confessions extracted, no hidden witnesses uncovered at the last moment. The resolution rested on records, science, and lawful procedure. This outcome reinforced public confidence in systems that operate patiently rather than theatrically. The quiet aftermath extended to how the story was archived. The file was labeled solved, but annotations included recommendations for future review in training contexts. Digital copies were stored redundantly. Physical evidence was preserved according to statute. Nothing was discarded casually. The respect shown to the record mirrored the respect shown to the victim. As years passed, Newer cases drew attention, but Emily Larson's name surfaced each time winter storms slowed traffic or when holiday lights reflected off snow-covered streets. Her story reminded the community that even in familiar places, vigilance matters, and that justice often arrives not with noise but with resolve. By the time the 10th anniversary of the arrest approached, the case had settled into history. There were no anniversaries marked publicly, no ceremonies. Instead, there was continuity. The town functioned, the system held, and the knowledge remained that a young woman's life had been accounted for through lawful means. In the end, the significance of the case lay not only in its solution, but in how it was solved. It demonstrated that methodical investigation, respect for evidence, and patience across seasons can overcome the silence of time. Emily Larson's case closed without spectacle, but with certainty, leaving behind a quiet affirmation that even the coldest cases can be brought to light when diligence endures. The final chapter of the Emily Larson case unfolded without ceremony, marked by silence rather than spectacle, and by acceptance rather than relief. Once all appeals were exhausted and the sentence affirmed, the legal system turned its attention elsewhere. Yet for those who had carried the weight of the investigation, the ending was not an endpoint but a settling. It was the moment when a long, unresolved question finally stopped echoing through winter after winter. In the years following the conviction, Iowa's seasonal rhythms continued unchanged. Snow arrived early some years, late in others. Christmas lights lined the same streets. Thanksgiving gatherings filled the same homes. The difference lay beneath the surface. Residents no longer spoke of Emily Larson in terms of uncertainty. Her story had a defined conclusion, one supported by evidence rather than assumption. That clarity mattered. It allowed memory to replace doubt. For investigators, the case became a quiet benchmark. When younger deputies asked why evidence lockers held items decades old, supervisors pointed to the Larson file. It demonstrated why patience is not optional in law enforcement but foundational. The purse recovered from a snowy ditch had spoken years later only because it had been protected when it seemed mute. That lesson carried forward into every subsequent investigation. The courthouse archive preserved the case with care. Digital records were backed up. Physical files were sealed and cataloged. Nothing was discarded that might one day serve training or review. The system treated the conclusion not as an end, but as a responsibility fulfilled. Justice, in this sense, was not a moment but a process completed honestly. Emily Larson's name remained present in small, deliberate ways. A scholarship continued quietly, awarded each spring without press. Recipients were told only that it honored a local student whose life ended too soon and whose community valued perseverance. This understated remembrance reflected the tone of the case itself. There was no desire to relive the details, only to acknowledge the life behind them. Her parents moved forward cautiously. They marked holidays privately, not as anniversaries of loss but as reminders of time reclaimed from uncertainty. The absence of unanswered questions allowed grief to change shape. It became less about searching and more about remembering. This shift, subtle but profound, was the true aftermath of resolution. Daniel Price's existence receded into the background of the state prison system. His case appeared only in procedural logs and legal databases. There were no revelations, no late confessions, no attempts to redefine the narrative. The evidence had spoken fully in court, and nothing afterward altered its weight. His story ended where accountability begins, in confinement without attention. The places connected to the crime continued their ordinary lives. The road where the purse was found carried farm traffic and school buses. The drainage site blended back into the landscape. These locations were no longer marked by investigation tape or memory alone. They returned to function, their significance preserved only in records and recollection. This return to normalcy was not erasure but restoration. Each December, as cold air settled over Iowa, the sheriff's office conducted its routine seasonal briefing. Winter safety, holiday patrols, and rural visibility were discussed. Occasionally, a senior officer referenced the Larson case, not by name but by principle. Reduced traffic, darkness, and isolation create opportunity. Awareness and procedure counter it. The lesson endured without dramatization. The community's trust in its institutions deepened quietly. There was no celebration of the system, only confidence reinforced by experience. People understood that justice had not arrived quickly, but it had arrived correctly. For an older generation accustomed to measuring outcomes over years rather than moments, this mattered deeply. It aligned with their understanding of responsibility and consequence. Emily Larson's case also reshaped how the town thought about memory. Missing person flyers faded from bulletin boards, but her photograph did not disappear from collective awareness. Instead, it shifted context. She was no longer a question mark but a resolved story. This allowed remembrance without fear, acknowledgement without speculation. From a broader perspective, the case illustrated the evolution of investigative work over time. What could not be proven in 2003 became provable years later through advances in science and analysis. This progression reinforced the importance of preserving evidence even when answers seem unreachable. The future, investigators learned again, often holds tools the present does not. As the final years passed and new cases occupied attention, Emily Larson's name surfaced less frequently, but never vanished. It appeared in training manuals, in quiet conversations, and in moments when patience was tested. Her story reminded those who listened that justice does not require urgency to be effective. It requires fidelity to process. The end of the case did not bring peace in the conventional sense. It brought alignment. Facts aligned with evidence. Questions aligned with answers. Memory aligned with truth. This alignment allowed the community to move forward without forgetting, to live without searching. In the final accounting, the significance of the Iowa 2003 cold case lay not in its shock but in its resolution. A young woman's life had been taken, but her disappearance was not allowed to dissolve into time. Through winter storms, technological change, and institutional persistence, the truth was uncovered lawfully and completely. Emily Larson's story closed quietly as it had been told. No spectacle marked its end. Only certainty remained, steady and unyielding, like the Iowa winters that framed it.